Welcome. This is Subin Cho, and I'm a project consultant of the Preparatory Office for the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites under the auspices of UNESCO. Pleasure to meet you all at the 2020 online lecture series on Understanding World Heritage, Interpretation and Presentation. Thank you very much for joining today's lecture. As all of you may know, the world is facing one of the biggest threats it has faced for decades. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, 61 countries among 167 state parties have fully closed their World Heritage sites located in their country, and the sites located in the other 44 countries are having partial closure. We all miss that one sunny day out with our friends and family at World Heritage sites. Well, until today, hope you and keep your concern and attention on the World Heritage sites by sharing latest issues and your opinions on the sites online. And we hope the online lecture series with World Heritage professionals offer you a great opportunity on that point. The 2020 will be held twice a month until 26 November 2020. The first and the second lecture was on last month. Please check the videos of the lectures by Neil Silberman and William Logan on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Today, we will have a lecture with Dr. Shu-Mei Huang, and there will be 3 more lectures with World Heritage professionals. Please take a look at the Facebook page of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lectures. If you are joining the lecture on YouTube, you can find the link for the Facebook page on the live streaming video's description. If you have any questions on the lecture, please leave comments on our YouTube or Facebook's live streaming video. We will have time for questions after having the lecture. Now, I'd like to give a brief introduction to our lecturer, Dr. Shu-Mei Huang. Dr. Shu-Mei Huang is an assistant professor at the Graduate Institute of Building and Planning at National Taiwan University. Her research area intersects heritage studies, indigenous studies, and recovery planning. She has published her work with the International Journal of Heritage Studies, Journal of Inter-Asia Studies, Journal of Planning Education and Research, and many others. Her co-authored book manuscript titled Heritage, Memory, and Punishment, Remembering Colonial Prisons in East Asia was recently published. Now, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I think we might need some times for a couple of minutes because our YouTube is making some internet connection errors. So we will stop our lecture for a couple of minutes, and then I'd like to introduce our lecturer once again and move on to our lecture today.
It's my honor to take part in the series arranged by the Preparatory Office for the International Center for Interpretation and Presentation of the World Heritage Sites. I myself have learned a lot from the previous talks. My research into difficult heritage are focused in Asia Pacific. In this talk, I will discuss World Heritage interpretation and reconciliation. I will focus on how interpretation matters and varies, especially in cases resulting from trauma and conflicts, which is unfortunately a significant part of human history, but has not been carefully addressed until a rather recent time. The past few months in this year actually witnessed unprecedented activism of Black Lives Matter across borders. As a result, there are calls for art and heritage sectors to support decolonizing collections and the imperial narratives around objects in museum collection or at heritage sites. In particular, those that have supported or have been acquired by means of colonial aggressions or with the profits of the slave trade must be identified, reviewed, and reinterpreted if not necessarily taken down. In the UK and the US, there have been growing discussion over giving clear and explicit information to audiences on history of the object and its acquisition and how it came into the possession of the museum, investigating the reasons and deeper context. In the region of Asia Pacific, however, we are yet to fully reflect on how we can do better to decolonize the relationship among the heritage sites, the institutions that manage these sites, and the communities associated with the sites in different ways. Interpretation is never easy. There is never just one authorized interpretation of heritage. Even the UNESCO Heritage Program has established its goals as an instrument for the sustainable development of all societies through dialogue and mutual understanding since 1972. There has never been easy agreement on interpretation of heritage. In academia, too, understanding of heritage varies depending upon one's disciplinary orientation. Ecologists focus on biodiversity, while architectural historians emphasize the notion of authenticity. Some sociologists saw the appreciation of heritage as symptoms of late modern society, while political scientists pay attention to the cultural nationalism behind domination. Interpretation can even diverge within the same community. For example, we can see these two materials both about the Hashima Island and how it is interpreted differently among Japanese experts. On the left, I am showing you the pamphlet available at the 39th UNESCO meeting in 2015. On the right, I'm showing you a documentation done by a Japanese architectural historian published in 1970. It highlights the concrete high-rise buildings that appear at Hashima Island as the earliest experiment of dense living in a rather compact environment as early as the 1910s. And again, on the left, in the booklet used for the UNESCO nomination, quote, Hashima Coal Mining Island is an artificial reclaimed island, the site of Japan's first major undersea coal exploitation, pioneered by Mitsubishi, and host to one of the world's most extraordinary former mining communities, end of quote. Here, we can see how the focus is placed on the extraordinariness. On the right, the architectural historian introduced the building, number 18, focusing on the bridge at the front that will connect the residential complex with the harbor. And in there, numerous photos exhibit the difficult situation, living condition on the island. Here, I'm just quickly showing you two materials and how interpretation can even vary within the same community, with one represented the state and one represented the architectural history as a discipline. And it is notable that none of them highlight the exploitation of labor in general, nor the forced laboring of Korean workers before the war. So in this slide, how can World Heritage Sites contribute to the historical process of reconciliation? How can the conversation over reconciliation be taken into account in interpreting related World Heritage Sites? On the surface, heritage sites has become even more contested in line with the globalization of memories. In effect, many contested heritage were legacy of tragic events resulting from a much longer term of uneven history of globalization itself. In Dresden, Germany, the reconstruction of Frauenkirche more than half a century after the wartime bombing was seen as a symbol of reconciliation. The new Golden Cross of Peace atop the dome was crafted by English goldsmiths whose father had participated in the bombing as a pilot. It takes time and a lot of international conversation to arrive at this particular moment. In many cases, difficult process of communication is yet to unfold. The kind of conversation in need is beyond placing blames, but conversation that would enable greater accountability and mutual understanding in terms of how to move on and avoid repeating the violence in the context of ongoing uneven globalization. In terms of global accountability, other than international trials, public apology has become increasingly important in the past decades. And we have seen the Pope apologizing to the Jews, Belgium to the people of the Congo, the British Queen to the Maori, and so on and so forth, which can only be understood via the globalization of national political consciousness. Politicians, governments, and social agents act as if the whole world is watching us. The development of communication technology, of course, contribute to the globalization of communication and public apology. Sometimes people try to discover closure through a symbolic act such as an apology. The hope is that apology can provide a meaningful conclusion to a difficult chapter of history, but in reality, each generation might want to interpret differently as they related themselves to the past differently. And it is unfortunately oftentimes we are seeing beginning of new conflicts laid on to top of the heritage sites in the refusal to acknowledge and to feel the remorse. Thus, closure might be reopened if necessary recognition and interpretation are absent. In recent years in Australia, we are seeing the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologize to the indigenous people in 2008. More recently in Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen apologized to the indigenous people soon after officially starting her service to the people. A more recent example can be found in North Carolina, where Davidson College issued a public apology for its ties to and complicity in slavery in the past August. It announced that the school is adopting a racial equity action plan that includes providing education of racism and slavery, ensuring living wages for campus workers, and reviewing the names of key spaces and buildings, including an iconic building named in honor of an early benefactor of the school who engaged in slave trading. In Taiwan, we are seeing trying to do the same with establishing the Transitional Justice Commission, TJC, which is also in charge of identifying difficult heritage as related to the unjust processes of capturing, imprisoning, sentencing, or killing of dissidents in the post-war years. In this slide, a former prison on the Green Island is listed as a national monument and reused as part of the National Museum of Human Rights. Earlier, we've already seen the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established in South Africa, and soon the maximum security prison on Robben Island was listed as World Heritage for its witnessing the history of people pursuing freedom and democracy under oppression. We might want to see the nomination as both a result of and a cause of reconciliation as processes. But ongoing conflicts and reconciliation yet to be made are also critical issues and prevailing everywhere, especially in cases in which indigenous people and their traditional territories are involved. The recent nomination of the Inca road system submitted by 5 nations was held up by committee members as a model of peaceful cooperation, while no mention was made of the long-standing indigenous protests in Argentina opposing the inscription. Earlier, the case of Kakadu National Park in Australia is also an important reference. Heritage matters were intersected by mining in the traditional territories of the indigenous people, whose participation was not ensured nor respected at the first place. William Logan, the speaker from 3 weeks ago, published an important paper about how the Jebiluka case highlights the importance of governance and political factors in understanding heritage protection as cultural resources. So when we talk about reconciliation and heritage, we have to pay attention to the scale of reconciliation that could include domestic trauma, bilateral conflicts, and regional reconciliation, and the fact that they are often intertwined across scales. We also need to pay attention to the broader context in which reconciliation is placed along with apology, compensation, repatriation. It is never a straight road. There is no one-for-all roadmap for us to get there. And in this light, heritage can be seen as both a result of and a cause of reconciliation as processes. Apologists want to be forgiven, to restore institutional integrity, to find closure, and shed light on the way to move forward. It takes time for the following actions to materialize, and most importantly, for the wounds to heal. Sometimes the wounds would be reopened if the foundation laid by the former apology is removed. As we can see in the historical apology made by the then Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama's talk in 1995, and how the effort has been seemingly redone under the Abe administration. In retrospect, that year of 1995 is quite remarkable because it was also when the former President France, Jacques Chirac, acknowledged his country's responsibility for deporting tens of thousands of Jews to German death camps during World War II. While the Abe administration was seemingly moving away from the long road toward reconciliation with its neighboring countries, in 2018, France announced that it will rebuild a Holocaust museum and train station used in transport. It might be helpful to also look at how apology could be made in a more interactive way. In this case, Germany apologized for Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the modern Czech Republic apologized for the expulsion of millions of German civilians living in the disputed Sudetenland. And following from there, the Czech Republic submitted the case of Fortress of Terezín as a heritage site in 2001. Unfortunately, it was seriously spotted in 2002, which is one of the reasons why it has remained on the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage. In stimulating debate about history and its significance, acknowledgement of wrongdoing puts the issue on record formally and publicly, and on this note, reflecting the agency of historical apology and how it matters to world heritage. It is important to demand that those who are benefiting from World Heritage sites taking accountability to ensuring the learning from the past. And here I want to introduce a quote from the former Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson. Quote, "The future we are shaping now is the past that we will share tomorrow." This is a quote from the former Prime Minister Persson, who plays an important role in bringing about the internationalization of the talk over how to remember the Holocaust. It is quite difficult to do that, and it takes time. In the case of the Holocaust heritage, it was actually done long after one of the most famous heritage sites, the Auschwitz concentration camp, was listed. It was until in 1998 in Stockholm, Prime Minister Persson invited the US President and the British Prime Minister to a meeting on the Holocaust, attended by diplomats and historians of the Holocaust who were engaged in the restitution process. And next year, the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research was founded in Washington with further participation of Germany and Israel. It was the aim of the minister to transform his national memorial activities into a transnational policy. So together with all the prominent experts, diplomats, politicians, he created a governmental network of action to develop a program for Holocaust education in various countries and to root its lessons in the respective societies. And one may wonder if similar networking, similar conversation could take place in the region we are in. In the rest of the presentation, let me turn to some cases related to the legacy and difficult memories in relation to colonialism and conflicts before World War II in East Asia. First of all, the site of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution. which is listed in 2015. And here I'm showing you a table, again presented in the pamphlet available at the 39th session of World Heritage Committee in Germany. Within these three industrial typology, the pamphlet introduced the 23 components part in 11 cities within 8 areas. And the notable case of Hashima Island is located in the Nagasaki era. And one of the biggest issue about this nomination has to do with its periodization that ended in 1910. And thereof selectively remembering and excluded the part about colonization of Korea. When visitors arrive in Nagasaki, like I did last year, one would find herself enjoy overlooking the Nagasaki port and the beautiful landscape where the Glover House is located. Quote, construction illustrate a fusion of British colonial style with traditional Japanese structural craftsmanship and landscaping, end of quote. This is a quote from its official webpage. Yet the interpretation hardly mentioned the costs of industrial development and exploitation under colonialism and imperial expansion being a central part of the historical process across borders. Most people might not have enough time and luck to visit the Hashima Island on boat themselves. Even if they are there, it is still not easy to receive the multiple interpretations of the heritage sites. Following the nomination, researchers and observers have pointed out the issues along with the case-specific narration and periodization. So again, there's debates about how the case living out the years following 1910 and the issues of colonialism and forced labor. So therefore, the UNESCO World Heritage Committee took time debating, discussing, hoping to bring about changes. So it would be important to know how several publication of interpretation strategy or revision of guideline has made some important advice. For example, quote, interpretation should allow an understanding of the full history of each site. It would be, while the period relevant to outstanding universal value will be the primary focus, interpretation will also include important aspects of the history of each component part before and after the period related to outstanding value. And regarding the revision made to the operation guideline, it would be important to know how important it is for the following cases to invite state parties to engage in dialogue with all stakeholders as part of the national processes to include the site on the tentative list. And state parties are encouraged to refrain from including on their list that cases that may potentially raise issue before these issues are solved through a dialogue with concerned state parties. And here focuses on how interpretation should ensure a feeling and spirit of inclusiveness, and through the facilitation of the involvement of stakeholders and associated communities in the development and implementation of interpretive programs. Yet, even with all this discussion and advices, it's still unclear how the interpretation of this site can be more inclusive. And as we can see within the report that listed conservation issues represented to the World Heritage Committee in 2018 regarding the case of Hashima, mainly the discussion is about the maintenance of the seawall and related conservation technique, but not so much about the issue of interpretation. Interpretation must be difficult as memories are layered, and in the layering, memories are recreated and represented, which is partially embodied by these human event strata on display at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Most visitors will visit the dome both across the river and in front of the building. Yet much fewer visitors would pay a visit to the memorial park, where you can find at the corner, you can find a memorial for Korean victims in the, as you can see on the right. Like in many cases, the interpretation offered on site is often limited, mainly focusing on the visible physical aspects of the heritage rather than the invisible, difficult memories at the corner of the park. When I was there 3 years ago in Hiroshima, we could see exhibition about the historical visit of the former US President Barack Obama in 2016. And like this, we have seen much more attention given to notable politicians rather than remembering and interpretation from the bottom up. In order to encourage a more interactive interpretation based on cross-border conversation, it might be as important to highlight in this case visitors from the former colonies, such as Koreans and Taiwanese people's experiences and understanding of history, as the former US president's visit to Hiroshima. Otherwise, it would again reinforce the nation state's power over dominating interpretation of heritage and preventing heritage from being more inclusively understood and communicated among people. Towards the end, I would like to talk about the final case of the Shen leprosarium in relation to similar cases in South Korea, Malaysia, and elsewhere. In Taiwan, we have this list of potential World Heritage sites to promote cross-border understanding of cultural heritage since 2002. Among the 18 sites listed, there are 2 sites of indigenous heritage, as you can see on the right. And in addition, the case of the Leshan leprosarium is worth some more discussion here. Leshan leprosarium was built in 1932 under the Japanese colonization. In the same period, under the same public health knowledge that focused on segregation, Japan also built leprosies in its interior lands and Korea. Cases were also present available in the British Strait settlement, the Philippines, Hawaii, etc. Leprosariums at that time were similar to an institution of total control, where the patient's freedom of movement and social participation were seriously deprived. But it was only until very recent this case and the suffering of the patient gradually became known, as the Xinjiang Metro line construction was going to demolish the leprosarium and rehouse the aging patients in a high-rise building. So unprecedented activism occurred, which brought attention to the case and eventually saved half of the leprosarium. Today, the preserved area is planned as a national cultural park of Hansen disease and medical human rights. But for the activists and those living there, the oppression has been ongoing. The construction of the depot and workshop for the metro line has again handicapped the patient's everyday life and postponed the preservation of the leprosarium. And the activism has extended beyond border in this regard. The self-help group actually has worked with the International Association of Integration, Dignity, and Economic Advancement, Taiwan chapter since 2007. And actually in 2010, the former secretary of the self-help group, Mr. Lee, was invited to Korea to participate in the initiating of Seoul Declaration, which brought attention to the well-being of the patients and to recognize and protect the heritage site related to the particular history of Hansen disease as much as possible. In the past decade, there have been efforts to bring together sites across borders for serial nomination of World Heritage, including cases from the Philippines, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Hawaii, Malaysia. Yet a variety of challenges have discouraged the preparation. Some countries have started to work on their own individual submissions, such as you can see here. The Korean leprosy archives in the Philippines was inscribed into the memory of the war in 2018. And last year, the case of Sangay Below leprosarium in Malaysia was added to the tentative list of World Heritage Sites. It is a pity, however, without cross-border collaboration being continuing, there is less likely that the issue of colonialism, exclusion, and resistance would be emphasized, especially the spirits of cross-border activism, which is such a great pity. And even if it seems inevitable given the limited frame of narration set up by each nation state, here we are seeing the possibility and the limits of World Heritage as an internationalized, institutionalized framework of interpreting the past. So to close my presentation, I do believe that World Heritage sites, especially those of contested history, might offer possibilities for the visitors who go beyond locating the perpetrator or judging about crimes and culpability. It has the potential for the visitors in being there to understand how wrongful decisions were made and brought about disastrous consequences. In doing so, we might be able to learn from the past and avoid making the same mistake. However, communities suffering from the pain, shame, and anger might have courage and empathy towards one another and be more willing to take necessary actions to re-establish connections. Interpretation of heritage sites should play a role in guiding this journey, but it is the communities across borders who have to actively participate in making heritage sites meaningful for all. And I think the UNESCO World Heritage Program would have responsibility to facilitate and encourage this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate for your lecture. And would you stop screen sharing?
Yes.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Professor. And appreciate for your lecture. Your lecture was really interesting for us, especially on the different interpretation. And heritage interpretation is really important for cultural reconciliation. So I believe that today's lecture was really helpful for our viewers and people, especially to people who are interested in World Heritage sites. And our viewers left questions about the lecture today, and I will read the first question. Well, the first question is, multiple interpretation on a site is really important, but how can we promote the hidden perspective of interpretation to the public? For example, how can we reach such small locals' perspective over the selected interpretation?
Yes, it has to do with the fact that most government-funded programs or government-funded interpretation are not doing enough to actively invite the minority, the underprivileged community to participate in, to offer their understanding of heritage. So for example, in Taiwan, we have cases in which we are seeing really conflicting understanding of heritage sites between the indigenous people and the ethnic Han Chinese living on the island. It's only until very recent years the government started to pay attention to this and actively invite indigenous people to offer their understanding of the sites. And in some cases, actually the interpretation was then rewritten and giving priority to the indigenous people's understanding of the site. But I think it would be important to, I would prefer we keep all the records. I mean, the changing process of understanding for the next generation to understand how transformation has been made in conversation, instead of having one dominating voices erasing another. So I think, and if we also like cite other examples that might involve the conflicts in the region in East Asia, I think it might be important to pay attention to those transnational communities. For example, in Taiwan, I have colleagues who is Japanese, married to Korean, and are raising their children in Taiwan. So how would these young children, transnational young children, understand heritage, especially contested heritage in East Asia? I think should be paid more attention to. So that's my quick answer to this first question.
Thank you, Professor. Highly appreciate for your answer for the question. And there's a second question, and I will read it now. Well, in the UK, the National Trust recently released numbers of its sites which have links to slavery. Since the UK was basically founded on slavery, but heritage legislation has also meant that many old properties cannot be maintained by their historical owners and are now under management of heritage organizations, which have been affected by COVID-19. Income is now a struggle, and they are probably not in a position to use income for reparation type activities. So, notwithstanding the fact that the current owners were not complicit in the historical acts, then the question is, can you provide your ideas or examples of how such sites can adapt?
Well, I think the question, the multiple issues involved in this question has to be unpacked. Some of them I think might be able to adjust in short term. Some of them really like requires much longer time and energy. And yes, COVID-19 is bringing unprecedented challenges to all aspects of our life, and of course, the heritage sector is seriously impacted. But I don't think we can use it as an excuse to postpone what is important and what has to be done. But of course, budget, the size of funding available would matters how much we can do and how quick we can do how much. But I can't really like cite a quick example telling you how to adjust to this COVID crisis. But in regarding the issue about decolonizing heritage, I think there are many ways we can do, and ways that do not necessarily require a lot of money.
Thank you for your answer. And I think this one is the last question for us today due to lack of time. And the last question was on our Facebook. The question is, Professor, you mentioned that interpretation is dependent on layers of memories, and memories are always reinterpreted. Then how often might one need to review and redesign their interpretation programs?
How often? I can't really give you a number, but I think community participation has to be a part of the institution that operates managed heritage sites. I mean, it has to be a constant part of the operation. So it's not that, oh, let's review it every 5 years or every 10 years. I think having community participation in interpreting heritage can ensure the dialogues keep going and making sure that we can have enough educational program, educational effort, outreach to the most underprivileged people. And I think it is also important for institutions of heritage to make it clear that heritage interpretation of heritage site should not be fixed. And if we consider heritage as part of our everyday life of the global community, then the conversation over interpretation of world heritage should be a dynamic part of our life. And we can see that as a great window for us to understand multiple interpretation of historical events across border. So if we see it this way, then I don't think we will be that anxious about this need to keep updating interpretation of heritage.
Thank you. Appreciate for your lecture and appreciate for having a Q&A session with our viewers today. And genuinely appreciate once again for you all for joining the lecture of the lecture series on World Heritage Interpretation and Presentation. Thank you, Professor Shu-Mei Huang.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next lecture under the agenda, 1972 World Heritage Convention and World Heritage Interpretation will be on 22nd October. Dr. Wei will be the lecturer for the day, and it will be held at 3 p.m. KST and 8 a.m. CET. Please check the Facebook channel of the Preparatory Office for further information on the lecture series. And due to the internet connection error, our lecture has been delayed for today. So we will upload the recorded lecture video on our Facebook and YouTube page once again. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope to see you all at the next lecture. Thank you.